Let me ask you something. Have you ever had difficulty locating a missing scripture? While 400 people are staring at you? Would you believe it's an old preacher trick we learned in school? Not. But it does have some advantages. One, it draws everyone's attention. Two, people begin to pray. And third, they dig in their Bibles, hoping to help the man out, or else the sermon will never end. I went back to look at the PowerPoint. I thought, where did I mess up? Well, it was actually right on the screen. So if you download it, the order there was right, but I had the two passages reversed. I'm thankful that Scott Hansen continues to work on our website and has put a slider up there so that you can access the lessons and the PowerPoint outlines there as well. And certainly none of that stress this morning can compare with what we're going to see in chapter 17 as this young man David becomes the giant that kills Goliath. Or actually, it's God, greater than this 9-foot-tall Philistine, who uses David as his tool. David with the stone in his sling. David himself is the stone in God's sling. And again, he says, "It is the Lord who will deliver you into our hands." And while David has the training and the preparation and the trust and the tools, all the credit and all the glory go to God above. Open your Bible there to 1 Samuel chapter 17. You might think of this boy as an unlikely hero. Certainly Saul, the current king, was head and shoulders above all the other Israelites. He didn't step up. Then you had Eliab, the firstborn in Jesse's house, and the two next sons, and they were there, and they were treated as well. And this crowd cowering off on the side as they're camped there in the valley of Elah. And this huge man, daunting, intimidating, terrorizing, keeps taunting and teasing and provoking the people of Israel. And more than that, their God. And so this boy, coming to see about his brothers and how the war and the conflict are going, steps up and says, "I fought the lion and the bear." And God is able to grant victory over the threat that we face. We're going to divide the passage into two parts. We're going to talk about a giant challenge and then a giant conqueror. So let's consider different aspects as we look at the scripture together. Let's talk first of all about the setting. As chapter 17 starts, it notes the Philistines gathered their armies for battle at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They camped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Damim. Saul and the men of Israel gathered, camped in the valley of Elah, drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley, that's the valley of Elah, in between. You can sit in that valley today under the shade of a tree. The width of the wadi, or the valley, is about a mile. It's not a narrow ravine, but more like a vast canyon. The ancient site, probably a mile wide, wider toward the mouth of the canyon. On the south side, you can see the hill of Soko, occupied by the Philistines. And on the north side, the hill of Azekah, where the frightened Israelites stood. And there's often a stream of water flowing down through Elah. I thought this evening we might take a view and look at some photos of this area and help us all identify where they're situated. Here is obviously a map drawn where you can see Ekron and Gath over to the west. These are two of the 5 Philistine cities. And then over to the east, Jerusalem, and south of it, Bethlehem, the Dead Sea, Jordan River coming down. And in between, this valley of Elah. But I also want to use the Pictorial Library of Bible Lands, a set of images that I have purchased just for this purpose, and help us go into the region where all these things occurred. There you'll see Jerusalem and Bethlehem, as we noted a moment ago, but not far from there is the valley of Elah, Soko and Azekah. I'm always impressed by the fact that these sites are so close to each other. When you visit Israel and you're at one spot, you just look over the way and there's another where something significant happened. It also moves me to realize that these are real places, real events, and real people. We go in a little bit larger there. Perhaps you can see in the center Azekah and Gath just to its west. If you look farther west, you'll see the other Philistine cities. Look along the coast. The Philistines were the sea peoples. You have Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. And just above my circle, it goes through the word Ekron, and then in the circle, Gath. Goliath was from Gath, so he's called a Gittite. And as you look there in the center, you can see the valley of Elah. Well, here is an aerial view looking from the south. And I like the way this program then brings in the names of the various places. Like Azekah, you can see. If you were to go down to the south, you would come to Lachish. Up to the right, the north, Beth Shemesh. And that Elah Valley coming right down the middle. Here, looking from the east side, you can notice again the valley and Azekah and that diagonal route that comes through the area. Looking from the east, there Azekah and the Elah Valley. Here's another beautiful shot of the land there along that route. Beautiful, great to visit and to see, no matter what perspective you might have or from each direction. Azekah from the northeast, the valley looking back from Azekah. And here again noted the Elah Valley and these various sites located that are part of the layout in chapter 17. Now looking from the west, the Elah Valley, again indicated for you there. Soko, just to the east, sort of in the center there over to the right. And then from the west, here's the Elah Valley, so fertile and green, lush. And then looking from the west, the Elah Valley again. And then I thought you might want to see a pistachio tree. You like pistachios? Well, this was one of the photos. I thought, why not? And the sheep still grazing in that area today. And again, you think about young David and his experience and how God has used those things to equip him. The Elah Brook, from which David would have collected these 5 smooth stones. We don't know why he chose 5, no more and no less. It's only conjecture. Some will say, well, if the first one missed, he would have others to fall back on. And then someone notes, well, Goliath had 4 brothers, so maybe takes out Goliath and then he's ready for his siblings. But whatever the case, we're not told. But when you visit this spot today, all of us that have been there, what do we bring back home? 5 smooth stones from the valley of Elah. And then what happens at night when we're all gone? Big trucks from the Israeli Department of Tourism bring in more stones. And then a lot of other people, I got 5 stones from the valley of Elah. Yes, but where did they originate? I like to bring rocks back from places because I believe they are legitimate, genuine souvenirs. You can buy so many things that are made elsewhere and then shipped over. And yet, there you are, and you have that sense of connection with David and Goliath. Let's talk about this superhero now. As you look at verses 4 through 10, he's called a champion. And the idea is you pick up your strongest and tallest and most ferocious representative. If he wins, your whole side wins. If he loses, you all go down. Sort of like a hockey or soccer playoff where you have 2, one from each team, and everyone else watching and pulling for them. And that's what's going to happen here. But this man is so overwhelming, it's hard to imagine any kind of match for him. 9 feet tall, huge helmet, a suit of bronze armor, bronze shin guards covering his legs, and a bronze javelin. The iron point of his spear, just the point, weighed 9 pounds. And in front of Goliath was another soldier that carried his enormous shield, which may have been the height of an average man. So that a person standing about as tall as I do, most of you, wouldn't be able to get past that high shield. The giant was proud. He was loud. He was intimidating. He was invincible until he met a bigger, stronger giant. You know, all the way through the Old Testament, you can see that the one with the most muscle and clout runs everything. He's elected. He has the followers. He has the fear and respect of all the people around him. Where do these giants come from? Well, if you were to turn back to Joshua 11, 21 and 22, there's a mention of the Anakim, which were among the very tall people of the land at that time. And it says there in verse 22 that there were no Anakim left in the land, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. Joshua 11:22. I believe that reference is right, by the way. And Gath is the hometown of Goliath. Well, you can see other giants. You remember Numbers chapter 14 when the spies said, "Oh, we'll never conquer this land because we're like grasshoppers in their presence." Or you might go back to Deuteronomy 3:11 and read about Og, the king of Bashan. He had a bed that was 13 and a half by 6 feet. And because of that, many other people were hesitant to tackle him. But the Israelites did. And Moses said, in effect, if God could accomplish this, you have nothing to fear in the new land. Here's a proof positive of what the Lord can do. And so this man standing before the people of Israel had them shaking in their boots, even the king, Saul, and all the others that were there. Later in the record, in 2 Samuel 21, 15 to 22, you can read about more giants. And in verse 20 there, a man of great stature with 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. Read it yourself, 2 Samuel 21:20. And he was also born to a giant. And these continued to threaten the leaders of Israel, and particularly King David. Size was everything. Now think with me about the stress in verse 11. How would you and I have felt? I think sometimes if we can put ourselves in the text and feel what they felt, see what they saw, hear what they heard, how would we have reacted? Are there any among us that would have said, I would go after that guy. I have nothing to fear. I know that God will bring me through. That's what makes the courage and confidence and character of David so impressive. All around him are dismayed and greatly afraid. He's not affected by peer pressure. He's not silenced by the hordes of people that are all pulling back. He wants to step forward. And that brings us to think of the giant conqueror. I notice, first of all, David, in God's providence, is a courier. He's returned back to caring for the sheep in chapter 16. Even though he's been anointed, it's still a secret. And he goes back and forth between the court, helping Saul as his armor bearer, and taking care of the chores and the tasks back at home. Now we see this again. His father Jesse is advanced in years. The older sons have gone into the battle. This is verse 13. Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. David the youngest. And David going back and forth. And verse 17, his father tells him to take roasted grain and loaves of bread and bring it to his brothers, along with cuts of cheese for the commander. And he says, look out for the welfare of your brothers and bring back news of them, because they're all in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. Israelites on one side and the enemy on the other, and now Goliath coming out to taunt and to challenge and to ridicule the forces of Almighty God. You might think about David as parallel to Joseph in the book of Genesis, who in a similar way was sent by Jacob, his father, to check on the well-being of his brothers. And you remember how they put him down and were jealous of him and sold him off, and he went to Egypt. We're going to see David having a similar reaction from his older siblings because he doesn't count. He's the least. He doesn't measure up. We're the fighters. We're the tough guys. What's this little kid, scrawny boy mean showing up here? And yet these three tall, strapping sons of Jesse, not one of them will do what the kid brother will do. You see, in previous passage, we've seen David contrasted with his brothers. Now we see him contrasted with this towering Philistine. And in each case, David is the giant. David is the hero. David is the conqueror, compared with Saul, who apparently taller than anybody. And yet he refuses to step forward. Then look at verses 20 through 27. David comes, leaves the flock with someone else. He's in the circle of the camp. Israel and the Philistines in battle array, army against army. David leaves his baggage with the keeper, runs and greets his brothers. There's the champion coming up. Verse 23, from the army of the Philistines. I want you to notice something. If you were reading previously, you saw that the giant came down. Now the giant is coming up. He's advancing. He's taking more territory. And you can almost sense the people of God slipping back, giving him more and more ground. Is that happening in the world today? The forces of that old devil, his evil henchmen, trying to take God's ground that he has given to us? Who is the person among us that will recognize the battle belongs to the Lord? Not the one with the biggest shield or the heaviest spear or the longest javelin or the most pompous words, but rather the one who will trust and obey. So David hears these words that the giant is speaking. And when everyone else is afraid and they flee, the giant comes, they move back. Have you seen this man who's coming up? Surely he's coming up to defy Israel. Now look at the reward. You know, when the reward is high, you know it's a terrorist, it's a threat, it's a fugitive whose capture is essential, but dangerous and risky and life-threatening. Here's the ante. Here's what's in the pot for the individual that will face this 9-foot-tall champion. The king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And the Hebrew word rendered free may mean free from all taxes. Wouldn't that be nice? And any other responsibilities to the government or the nation. If you do this one thing, you are set for life, and you become Saul's son-in-law. And all you have to do is go head-to-head with Goliath. Whenever I read this, it reminds me of a rancher in West Texas who supposedly had a beautiful daughter, just one, a mansion and great wealth, and he wanted to find the most eligible bachelor to marry his daughter. This is on my mind because today is Carissa and Michael's 1-year anniversary. He had a swimming pool in the back, which he filled with sharks. And he put all the young men around the edge of the pool. He said, "I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Anyone who will jump in the pool among those sharks and make it safely to the other side, I'll give you your choice of my daughter or my stash of oil or my land." Instantly, one was in the water. Energetically, feverishly, powerfully, He went from one side to the other of the pool, and he came out, and the father was so impressed. What do you want? My daughter, or the oil, or the land? He shook his head. He said, I want the guy that pushed me in the pool. You know, sometimes when there is an obstacle, there's a dilemma, there's a difficulty, there's a bridge to cross, there's a mountain to climb, there's a task to be mastered. You and I don't want to be the one that has to be pushed into the pool, or the one that's pushing someone else in so that they will do what we're not willing to do. This is the thing with David. David is confident. David is curious. David is looking into what's happening so that he can be a part of the solution. Look what he says in verse 26. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Who's the giant? You see, when the people look at Goliath, he's the largest figure they see. But when David looks at God, Goliath shrinks down to size. Someone said that to most people, Goliath was too big to kill, but that to David, he was too big to miss. David was able to see the scene from a higher perspective. Well, then verses 28 and following, we noted that Joseph and now David were criticized by their brothers. Eliab's anger burns against his younger brother. Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Notice the put down. You're just the shepherd. You don't measure up to the older brothers and to me. And notice the phrase, few sheep. You're a nobody, David. Who's doing your little piddly job? I know why you've come. You're insolent. You're wicked in your heart. You just want to see the battle. David said, what have I done now? Was it not just a question? So often in families and in relationships where there's friction and tension, what happens is symptomatic of a deeper problem. Is it jealousy toward David? Is it disrespect? Is it a sense that he's unneeded? On the scale, he's a 0. Aren't you glad David didn't let that determine his worth? What if David had cowered to Eliab and said, oh, you're right, I should have stayed home. Let me go back to my little job and I'll let you big boys do the fighting here. I found that often when people argue about something, whatever is on the surface is just a reflection of what's growing down underneath. It's not just the fact that David is here. It's what underlies the tension and perhaps rivalry and other problems at home. You and I want to be forgiving, gracious, and supportive. We can always pick at other people. We don't want to be like that, assigning them motives. Oh, I know, you're insolent, you're wicked, you just want to see the battle. It's so easy to jump to conclusions and put others down. David was criticized. And then I went on to verse 33 because when he says to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Saul said, you're not able. You are but a youth. He's been a warrior from his youth. He has the experience. For whom do you think Saul was afraid? Perhaps for himself as well as his people. Because you see, we're letting everything ride on the person who makes the next move. It should have been Saul. It wasn't. Or Eliab, or one of the older men among the youth that were there, the soldiers. David is criticized. He doesn't let that stop him. Notice the courage which he shows when he talks about having battled the lion or the bear. rescuing the lamb from its mouth, seizing by the beard, striking him and killing him. I've killed the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. He has taunted the armies of the living God. The Lord delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear. He will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Don't you admire that faith? And maybe David is starting to realize that what he's been doing out in the field with those helpless animals, the sheep that can't find food or water, that would be lost if not for his presence, all of that's been not a waste of time, but training, equipping him, preparing him for this moment. You never know, brothers and sisters, what God is doing in your life right now that is setting you up for something yet to come. And so never minimize that fact. Well, David's courage is so strong, then he's told, "Go and may the Lord be with you," by Saul. Those seem like empty words. If the king really thought God would be with David, why didn't he think God will be with me? He's handing off, he's passing the buck, giving the ball to the one that's willing. Well, then he puts his garments, bronze helmet, armor on David. David girded his sword over his armor. He hadn't tested them. I can't go with these. I've not tested them. David took them off. What kind of man would go before a giant clad from head to foot without any protection, open and susceptible and in danger of having his life taken? One who determined that he didn't need all of that. It would hinder him rather than help him, because he served the living God who would give him the victory. And so, verse 40, took the stick in his hand, 5 smooth stones from that brook, put them in the shepherd's bag, his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. You know, the sling was not a slingshot, but was something like a piece of leather that one could load and whip around and around and around and finally let it go. What would you rather have, Goliath's spear or David's sling? You know the answer to that. Accuracy, mobility, power, simplicity, lightness of weight, portability. One man tells of watching a young man sitting under a Palestinian shade tree in modern times. The boy was herding goats by whizzing rocks. He would use his sling and sail a missile in front of a stray animal's nose and haze him back into the flock. And some Middle Eastern sling masters even today can kill a pigeon in flight. Don't underestimate what he took in his hand. Do you remember Judges 20:16? Out of all the soldiers in Benjamin, 700 choice men were left-handed. Each one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Think about the power. This young Palestinian boy was asked, "Can you hit that fig tree that's about 60 yards away?" He fired a small stone. It didn't just strike the tree dead center, but it had such velocity that it burrowed through the bark more than an inch into the trunk of that tree. Think about range. A spear could only go the distance that an arm could throw it, but a sling was lethal from well over 100 yards away. David the champion. Here's the match. The Philistine, his armor bearer with the shield, disdained David as a youth. He was ruddy or reddish, had a handsome appearance, but that was not his strength. His strength was his faith. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. It's a reminder that the real battle is not between these two men, but between the one true and living God and the gods of the pagans. David represents the Lord. Philistine his own gods. Come to me, I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky, the beasts of the field. David said, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I'll strike you down and remove your head from you. I'll give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know there's a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he'll give you into our hands. What do those words do to you? What impact does his example have on you? How does a statement like this from a basically unarmed boy with just his sling and pouch and 5 stones standing before this 9-foot-tall monster, speaking of victory with confidence and assurance, there's no doubt in his mind that's what's going to happen. How does that change your heart, your behavior, your motivation, your decisions, and your actions every time you put yourself there? Oh yes, he has a weapon and a stone in it, but as we've noted, David is the stone in God's sling. And though he will say, I will take you down, it will always be with the clear emphasis, the Lord is the one to whom the battle belongs. Look at this, the real giant killer. The Lord will deliver you. I will strike you. This is so common in Scripture, and it's true for us today. God is going to take out Goliath, but only, listen now, only through the faith and courage and boldness of young David. God can do it by himself, but he will not. He uses people, you and me, in the situation where he allows you to be, so that you could say with David, I will, the Lord will. Notice verse 47, the Lord delivers, but not by sword or spear. The battle is his, and he'll give you into our hands. You know what happens next? David only needs the one stone. It hits the Philistine in the head. Down he goes. The stone in his forehead falls on his face to the ground. Now, what do you hear from the Philistines? What do you see? What's going on with these haughty, cocky, this is our man, he cannot be defeated? What's happened? David then strikes him, kills him. Look at verse 50. No sword in David's hand. We might have noted a few moments ago, should have perhaps, that the Israelites did not have many iron implements. They used wood and they used rocks. The Philistines were more advanced in the area of metalwork, and so they had more sophisticated tools. David so then took Goliath's sword from its sheath, killed him, cut off its head. The Philistines, we're in trouble now. And they fled. The men of Israel and Judah arose, shouted, pursued them. And there were slain Philistines all the way along the road to Sha'arim, even to Gath and Ekron. The Israelites plundered their camps. David has a trophy, verse 54. It's the Philistines' head. I was thinking about this earlier today and how it's common for hunters to want to put the head of a deer up on the wall. What would you do with Goliath's head? Would you hang it somewhere? Would you put it in a trophy case? Would people come and see it? Who would want to do that? But you know, that was the sign of victory. And for David, this was proof beyond a doubt that no matter how tall, how daunting, how frightening the opponent may be, the battle belongs to the Lord. The Lord did it, but he didn't do it through Saul or Eliab or Abinadab or any of the others gathered there that day. Why David? Well, the training that David had experienced providentially, taking care of what nobody else would do, the sheep in the wilderness. The tools, you imagine how often he might have taken that sling for target practice. Maybe he used it to bring the sheep back in, like the Palestinian boy I mentioned a few moments ago in modern times. But at any rate, the trust in God that ultimately he would control the outcome. And then time. David didn't reach this point overnight, but he battled those lions and bears. God works with us the very same way. And courage is the fruit of tools and trust and time. I don't know what battle you might be facing. And I don't mean to allegorize the text and say, well, the first stone represents this and the second one that, because we can make up anything for that. But I do want to say that whatever stands before you, between you and your progress and your effectiveness and your influence for the Lord, identify that obstacle. Take your sling and your stones. Look at the tools that God has given you. Know this book. Pray. Prepare. Practice. Don't let anyone, whether the giant or the people around you, intimidate you or discourage you or stop you. And every opportunity you have, give credit to the power and glory and majesty of God. And remember that there are other people in your family, for example, like the Israelites depended on David, and whatever happened to David would happen to them. He must not fail, because then they would be slaughtered. Knock that giant in the head and then celebrate. I'm not suggesting you carry anyone's head around with you or hang it on the wall. But you find some way to share with others the victory God gives you over temptation, over sin, over the threats that the devil wants to bring into your life. David is the giant that killed Goliath because he knew the real giant. You and I, who trust and obey the living God, we refuse to be silenced. We refuse to quit. We refuse to give in and go along with the world. No matter how strong, how successful, how frequent those onslaughts may be, we're going to stand with the living God. If God could do that with David, what could God do with you and with me? This evening we encourage anyone that's not yet put Jesus Christ on in baptism, Galatians 3:26 and 27, to be clothed with Christ, putting your faith in Him at that point, confessing His name, turning from sin. Won't you make that decision now and let it be known? Or any other concern that you have as we stand and sing.